Okay, so welcome all. I'm so happy to have you here with us today. We are in these celebrations of the Women's Day 2025. And today, the Women Leadership Forum of P&G Alumni would like for this event to share with you our webinar on Women's on Board series. So my name is Rebecca Keat, and I'm leading the Women on Boards a program in the Women Leadership Forum of the P&G Alumni. So just a couple of words about what we're doing at P&G Alumni Women Leadership Forum. We are really working for P&Gers by P&Gers, and we want to be the most impactful and empowering professional women leadership network in the world, grounded in P&G values. I think you all feel, all the people that are now connected and that are today with us on the line, the same values that we share, these P&G family values that each time we meet each other, we can feel the bonding and as if we all knew each other forever. So our mission is to foster opportunities and enable impact for P&G women alumni around the world. And we have three simple areas of strategy for next year. One is to nurture leadership. We have a great coaching program that we share a lot of time and that is really enabling people to fulfill their full potential. Two, we enable meaningful connections. So this year is one of those years where we have the in-person conference in Berlin. So I hope to see you all in June. And we advance women's professional journey with the board program that is hosting this webinar today. So what is the board program? Actually, we want to create a dynamic marketplace for experienced P&G leaders, alumni, board-seeking women, and available positions on board. And to do this match. So we have four goals. One is to really enable the placement of women from the P&G network into board positions. Two is to help boards get the best candidates in the market. We believe that the P&G rounded profile is a real valuable addition to boards around the world. And it will help, it's the third objective, it will help companies to bring more diversity to their leadership and to have different women in different types of boards, be it NGOs or startups or private companies, but also in public corporations and large enterprises. So I want you to save the date of June 14th. We will meet there in the Berlin conference. We will do the official launch of our P&G Women Alumni Board Program. And I hope it will be very exciting. So moving on very quickly to our webinar series. So this is actually the third webinar of the year 2025. And the purpose of this webinar is to meet board members, to get some insights from board members, chairpersons, and headhunters about this question of women on boards or actually just being on a board, whether you're a woman or a man. But what is it that is really required? How is it gonna happen? How do I get this board position? We will also have practical workshops on board roles, on responsibilities, and finance basics. We will have representation across NGOs, startups, and other companies. In the last two sessions, we had women from different backgrounds doing really great roles and having a lot of impact. And this is also our background of impactful leadership in action that we want to promote. And we'll also have male allies, because we know that we also need men in the picture to promote our good objective and purpose, and they will also share their expertise. So I think this is a great chance to learn. I personally learn a lot when I attend those webinars, and I'm really happy to hand it on over to Debra Bass, who is going to moderate this great webinar session with Deeptha and Sarah that will also present themselves. So what are boards really looking for? Debra.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. So I'm Debra Bass, a proud P&G alum, and I've served on the Women's Leadership Forum board for many years. I'm honored to introduce our panelists today who will help us get under the hood on what boards are really looking for from two diverse perspectives, one from that of an independent board director and one from that of an executive recruiter. So we are fortunate today to have Deeptha Khanna, another proud P&G alum, who's the Executive Vice President at Philips and is Executive Vice President of the Personal Health Business at Philips and an independent board director at Kimberly-Clark Corporation, and Sarah Van Dyke, who co-leads the global consumer practice at Egon Zehnder. By way of flow, I will pose a question to each panelist in turn, have the other expand, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the discussion. So let's get right into it. So my first question is for Deeptha. What is the role of a board member, and how does that differ from a management team member? And you wear two hats in your life as a management team member at Philips, serving the board, and then as a board director at Kimberly-Clark, serving the management team. So over to you, Deeptha.
Thank you, Debra. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think it's important to start with acknowledging that the board and the management team do have a common goal. And that goal is to really ensure the sustainable, profitable growth of the organization in a way that creates value for all stakeholders. Right? That's important because that union is what then allows us to play our very specific roles. But most people here are very used to being operational leaders. The difference is quite simple. As an operational leader or a management team member, you're in the details of the business every day, dealing with situations and ensuring that you sort of overcome any adversities and push towards the opportunities. When you're a board member, your primary task is around creating the frameworks for supporting success. It's not around the daily management of work. And what do I mean by frameworks? It's really around pressure testing and soundboarding and supporting the management team in building out a sound strategy, in ensuring the right governance, in ensuring the right compliance frameworks, the right resourcing, and pressure testing for readiness to face risks. So these are some of the unique perspectives that a board plays, which are really in support of the management team and don't overlap with the everyday task of an executive.
Thank you. And Sarah, how would you build on that response?
Absolutely. First of all, it's such a pleasure to be here among this community. So thanks for inviting me. Deeptha, you described it beautifully. I've often heard it expressed and summed up in a very small phrase, which is it's critical for board members to be nose in and fingers out. And so that notion of being very engaged, but at the end of the day, the board's role is to serve the company, not the other way around.
That's great. I love the nose in and fingers out. That's a sticky phrase. So, Sarah, I'm going to have you start with the next question. What leadership experiences and competencies are boards looking for?
Absolutely. So look, boards are looking for critical competencies. They are looking for, first and foremost, the role of the board is governance. So strategic guidance and understanding of all of the stakeholders' needs and how they can govern forward. So we look for strategic orientation, many of the same leadership competencies, but really with that ability to step back and look at the whole picture. As we have been seeing some critical shifts going on in the boardroom, and boardrooms do go through pendulum swings, we went through a period where there was a real look for specialization in the boardroom. And what I'm seeing now is a step back, and in a world where boards are having to deal with such complexity at such speed, what we're looking for now is board members who can really look at the broad range of issues as opposed to being narrow subject matter experts. And so what is that looking like now? I often get questions of, are they only looking for CEOs and CFOs? I will say there's been sort of a conservative swing back to, looking for some of those core principles. But what is much more important than the function is active executives. They're really looking for people who are in it now. I can't tell you the number of boards that I'm working with right now who say, I need people, I need a sparring partner. The CEO is saying, I need a sparring partner. So I want people who are either active executives now or haven't been out of the game for more than 3 or 4 years, just because the world has changed so much. The functional experience that people look for, because I often get that question, and I know this audience doesn't only have CEOs and CFOs in it. There is a real need for kind of a leveled up of some of the functional experience. So it's not so much a digital expert, but somebody who has led through digital transformation. And if they can talk about their stories of how they've led their organization through digital transformation, that is highly valuable. International expansion. Again, critical growth lever for many companies, and looking at how can I have somebody who's had that experience that can bring that into the boardroom. Complex supply chain, real issue that has become much more of a board issue than it was previously. Marketing, again, not from how do I do that, although that's valuable, but much more how can we bring the voice of the consumer or the voice of the customer into the boardroom. So those would be examples of how functional roles can be translated into board needs and board competencies.
Thank you. And Deeptha, I'll have you build on it and also double click on some of your unique experiences and competencies that make you a sought after independent board director.
Thank you, Debra. Look, I fully agree with what Sarah just said. And I would only add, I think in addition to the qualifying experiences and strategic perspective, we have to remember culture and chemistry also count for quite a bit. At the end of the day, a board is also a team. And coming into the team and enhancing the way that they collaborate and drive the agenda is sort of an X factor that's often underlooked. In terms of my own experience, I think, when I think about, it's an exaggeration to say highly sought after, let me sort of caveat that, because, each one of us has unique experiences that are a fit with some and not a fit with others. But I would say, in my case, my global experience has been very meaningful to especially global consumer organizations, because my P&G career was largely in Asia, but then I worked with Johnson & Johnson in the US, and now I'm with Philips in Europe. And I think, the truly deep experiences operationally across 3 continents for global organizations is a pretty attractive perspective. I will say also, as I grew in my career, and especially where I am now with Philips, it's a technology company where there is a lot of fluency in terms of all things digital. E-commerce is 50% of our business. There's a proficiency and exposure to how to think about propositions, both from a hardware and software point of view. So that becomes distinguishing as well to what Sarah mentioned, which is the world moving towards, no matter what business you're in, creating experiences and consumer models that are centered in digital transformation. So I would pick just a couple of those, and then of course, brand building and the training that you get with the decades at P&G is something that never goes out of style, especially when you're in large consumer organizations where that competence is highly valued.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So the next question is actually a very hot topic that we know there are many discussions happening about, and that is, what is the value of diversity in the boardroom? And I think we see shifting winds around DEI policies, not only in the US, but also in other regions. So what's the value of diversity and how have the specs shifted over time? And Deeptha, I'm going to have you kick off this response.
Sure. Thank you, Debra. Look, I think, where I started the last answer, the board is a team. And I think the best boards and the chair of the best boards do try to make sure that the team is built together in a way in which there is complementarity of experiences that together can contribute to being a more effective sparring partner and soundboard to the executive team and to the CEO. So very often, I think that's what I've experienced, and I've been fortunate to be exposed both in my management role as well as in my non-executive role to boards that are very high functioning, and they are very diverse. when I look at the boards at both Kimberly Clark as well as at Phillips, the board has a mix of people with different kinds of industry backgrounds, different kinds of international and geographic exposure, and different qualifying experiences and different functional experiences that are not the same, but together make a very powerful body of experience that the management team can tap into. So I think that's really important, and that's where the diversity of experience matters the most. And look, times change and policies change, but I do find that a lot of pedigreed organizations now have abundant evidence around the importance of diversity strengthening really the contribution of results and the business impact. And I think those organizations with that pedigree continue to retain their values while being compliant where they need to be compliant. And those rules are different depending on where you operate. So I remain sort of optimistic that the proof of the value of diversity in all its forms is pretty well established. And there's more and more success that people can tap into and not seek to question all over again.
That's heartening to hear. And Sarah, go ahead and build on Deeptha's response.
I was just going to build to completely agree with you, Deeptha. I think we have all know as managers, as leaders, and as board members, diversity in all of its flavors is what makes a great team. And there is so much data. I think we're all pretty familiar with the statistics. I was looking at them last night. The McKinsey studies show that the top quartile for board gender diversity are 7% more likely to outperform financially. And that goes true, across the board as we think about bringing groups together that have diverse perspectives. So even in a time, and I'm based here in the US where there is quite a swing, I'm not seeing that conversation change, that suddenly that data isn't true. Everybody believes in the data and has seen the benefit of having more diverse boards. And so we'll continue to see that happen. I think if I'm being really honest, the shift when it comes to women on boards is where there was a very proactive wide door open. They are still going to look for extraordinarily capable leaders to come into the boardroom. But it may not be as proactive, but those spaces are still going to be there because the facts are diverse boards drive better financial results, and that's good business.
I'm going to double click on the women piece of your response because a lot of our audience are women seeking board positions. What unique challenges might women face on boards? And maybe Sarah, if you want to start, and Deeptha, you can expand.
Sure. I would say, I don't know if it's unique to women. I think whenever you are a minority in a group, that it is harder to have a voice. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time working with boards on as they go through their board effectiveness reviews is how do we bring all of the voices into the room? How do we make sure that new board members have support and buddy systems? How do we make sure that they have feedback? And how do we make sure that the chair and the entire board is listening to those differences of perspectives? I will say it is hard to be one of anything. And so one of the things I see boards really looking to is how do we have diversity all around the table so that it's just differences of perspectives, not affiliated with your identity in any way, shape, or form.
And Deeptha, anything to add there?
I would just add, I do agree it may not be that specific to the genders anymore, but when you come in new, I think there is this feeling of there is already a team and you're the newcomer. And I think it's really important to recognize that you're not just there in a relationship with the CEO or with the company that you're joining, but also with all the other teammates. And many of them will actually have a much different upbringing than what you're used to. Many of us, if you've grown up with executives that have been in a P&G culture or a Johnson & Johnson culture, you talk the same, walk the same. It's easier to find those connections. When now you're actually going to be challenged with some very diverse perspectives. And I think building fruitful relationships from the start is really important and frankly, a very rewarding part of the role and the exposure and experience you gain.
Deeptha, if I can build on that, I think what's harder in boards is you're coming together 4 or 5 or 6 times a year. So there's
Yes.
not those everyday sort of bump ins that you have. So being really proactive about building those relationships. Some of the people I've seen it do best, before their board meetings, they're having individual conversations. They're making a point of going to the cities where their fellow board members are and having a meal and just doing that much more effort in the relationship building. Because in order to have be able to voice judgment, to be able to influence and collaborate, we all know that starts with trust and relationship. And so investing in those relationships is critical.
So as women join a new board, as they build these deep relationships, it will help integrate them and enhance their effectiveness. That's really good perspective. So my next question is a little bit of a shift around structures. What are the different structures of boards, and what are the implications for the operating model? And this is really as we take a global perspective, because different regions of the world have different structures of boards. And maybe Deeptha, you could kick off that question.
Sure. Look, I think there's quite a number of nuances, but if I simplify it, I think there are 2 sort of primary models. And one of them is really a single layer board, where typically you have the CEO also acting as a chairman of the board. And this is quite common, I think, especially with US corporations, including where I am at Kimberly Clark. And then very often in Europe, you tend to have a 2-tier board. And in a 2-tier board, you actually have the management team or the executive team as a board of management, but then you have the supervisory board, which is in fact the non-executive board. And I think the interests and goals are quite similar in both situations. But what can happen is in a supervisory board system or a 2-tier system, the chair is part of that supervisory group. And there can tend to be more of an agenda setting that's driven by the supervisory board, with really an obligation of deeper governance and checkpointing, maybe a few more things than you would typically see. So that's it's really how the agenda gets set. Whereas what you find in the American board system, for the most part, though it's not 100% of companies that follow this system, when you have the CEO also as the chair, they really do drive also the agenda of where do they want to solicit input and where do they want to steer and leverage the resources of the board towards the biggest questions that are on their mind. And so I think there is a degree of empowerment that is a little different. Both models have their plus and minuses, and I think both can be high functioning. It comes down to trust and really making sure that the relationships are open.
Yeah, that's helpful. And Sarah, what might you add to that response?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking a lot about public boards, but there are all sorts of board opportunities. And I think it's important for people to think about, family-owned companies often bring in independence to the board. And so there will be a mix on that board of family members, as well as independent board members. Those independent board members play a critical role when it comes to independence, when it comes to judgment. In many cases there, that operating experience is so important because the family members may or may not have had that experience, and are really looking to the independent board members to drive governance. You've got private boards of other flavors, whether those are PE-backed or VC-backed. There, the makeup is going to be primarily investors, but they're also looking to bring on independence, whether that be for real functional expertise. A private board may be looking at it's a direct-to-consumer play in high growth, and they want somebody who's got really specific operational experience there. Because on a PE board and a VC board, there's a little bit grayer of a line between pure governance and advising. And the board gets more deeply involved with the strategy than they do on a public board. And then there are, of course, nonprofit boards, which is a whole nother structure, but the opportunity to contribute there. I will say, it's not a direct path. You do a nonprofit board and then you do a private board and then you're going to get a public board, because each of the governance structures are so different. But nonprofit boards can be extraordinarily rewarding and a way to give back to the community, as well as to create a network, which can lead to some of those other boards.
That's really helpful and a good reminder for each of us to cast a wide net and look for different types of board opportunities as we look to gain that experience. So the next question is to demystify the director recruitment process. I think many of us don't really know what's involved. Is it like interviewing for a typical job? Is it a different type of process? So Sarah, can you demystify the board director recruitment process for us?
I absolutely can. And I'll go through the sort of standard practice. There, of course, as many variations as there are boards. But typically what we see are the following steps. When we work together with the board, the first and the most important step that the board is working on is the specification development, just like you would a job spec, but really looking into what is it that we're looking for specifically to fill? Do we need somebody who's going to be able to sit on the audit committee? Do we need somebody who, one day could be chair of the governance committee? Are we looking for particular sector experience or functional expertise? So we go through a whole mapping of the skills on the board to help the board determine. And this is critical because once they start looking at people, we want to make sure the entire board, which we've said is a very diverse group of people, are really aligned on what they're looking for. We then go about the process of candidate identification, and this is different than executive search. If you are receiving calls from executive recruiters, you might get a call that says, hey, we're just kicking off this search, would love to hear a little bit more about you and see if you might be a candidate. That is something that takes place much later in the process. There is an internal process that takes place with the board where we develop a long list of potential candidates. These are candidates that are identified through our research, through our networks. This is why it's great to stay in touch with the executive recruiters in your life. I see Deeptha smiling. Certainly that has been the case with us. And we then present that to the committee. Typically it's the nominating committee, who review a list of as many as 30 people who could potentially fill that board seat. And they look through that to really identify, if we could have our wish list, who are the 7 to 8 people that we'd like you to go and call first. And those are people who, based on their experience, very often they will do some screening in terms of in their network, any reputational. And then as executive recruiters, we'll go out and we will call a very short list of people. I say that because I often get calls from people saying, I'm not getting called. I don't, why am I not on the list? And I have to reassure to say, you are on many lists, and it's not, I go back to the binders of candidates. It's not that at all. It's ever evolving. But because the process, you don't hear about it until you're a finalist, it may feel like you're not in the process when you may be in many processes. So I like to reassure people, if you are qualified, if you're in the conversations, you are being talked about, you may just not know so. And so then we get to, after we have assessed for, their judgment, their independence, their strategic acumen, their influence, do they have any conflicts with the dates? It seems silly, but that's one of the first questions, and our own referencing. Then they are introduced and we'll meet with members of the board. It may be the nominating committee chair first. It may be the CEO, depending upon the situation. And in that case, the interview process is different than an interview. It's much less about a resume of what you've done, and it is much more about your experience with boards. How have you navigated your own board if you haven't been on a board before? Have you been presenting to the board? What have you seen? In your management team, how have you managed through conflict? How have you seen the group work through difficult situations and come up with answers? I'd love to throw this to Deeptha, as you've been through many of these interviews. What are some of the questions that have come up for you that are different than what you might have had in an executive interview?
So it's a great question, Sarah, and I'm trying to think back. Look, I think one of the questions that does come in is really around how you made decisions that were short-term versus long-term oriented, right? Because very often as executives, we are pretty much, chasing the quarter, chasing the month, and get good at doing things that are short-term driven. But the role of the board is a little bit different. I've also had more thoughtful questions come through around our approach to organization and resource planning. Because one of the big tasks of a board is to make sure that the objectives of the management are well supported in terms of resources, and how do you sort of think about those experiences. So it's been a little bit more than what are your business accomplishments, which is typically what you end up talking about when you're in an executive role search, and a little bit more thoughtful on places that the board will uniquely play a role.
Mm. One of the other things that's different that I see in those interviews, so much of being a good board member is asking good questions.
Right.
So I always advise people as they're preparing for these interviews, be really prepared with your questions. I have had candidates who sort of surprisingly ran out of questions. And so much of your job is asking questions, but asking questions in a thoughtful, open way that leads the conversation forward, as opposed to in a closed, do you know the right answer way. So that's something else that's being assessed through these interviews.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your transparency too, and demystifying what the process looks like, because it is new and different for most of us. So really, really insightful. So my last prepared question before we go to the audience is, what advice do each of you have for those seeking a board, and how they could better serve a board if currently on a board? And maybe Deeptha, if you want to start there.
Sure. And look, I think as Sarah said, it's sort of important to recognize that there is a very wide variety of board roles one can go after. So you can cast your net wide. I think that's one of them. I will say, I also found it useful to think about it at the right stage in one's career. I genuinely am grateful that it's only now where I am sort of at a C-1 level reporting to the CEO, that I'm opening up to take on this additional responsibility, because it is a heavy responsibility. Even though it's only those few meetings in a year, it's a very serious commitment to another organization. The requirement to really understand deeply the business and take your time reading, researching, networking. It's all a lot of time and commitment and capacity, and you need to be ready for it. So I think that's a second piece of advice I'd give. And the third is, for those that are in organizations, it's very important to quickly assess the climate of support. And I was very fortunate that in an executive role, I not only had the permission, but actually the guidance from my manager and my chair was that they saw this as a very accretive and important experience for me at this stage in my career. So that created the conditions with which you can go out and take up an opportunity and then navigate some of the difficulties that come through, including dates and logistics, because there's often those kind of conflicts. And I've been lucky to pass that on to some people in my team. So in fact, where I am as an organization, we quite encourage 2 layers of management to get those experiences when they can. So it's good to sort of pressure test that as well. So I'd break it down to those 3 things really, right? So keep an open mind and cast a wide net, because it is a very interesting, a creative experience that could come to you in different forms. And a lot of it is pull driven, not push driven. It's not a job posting that you apply for. So you really have to be pulled. So, create the qualifying experiences that then allows you to be pulled. And then pick it at the time when you truly know you're going to have the bandwidth and the capacity to do a good job with the right support.
And Deeptha, one question, as you have the support and encouragement from your management that it would be accretive, is serving on an independent board helping you be more effective in your day job? Just curious, like what you're getting from that experience and how it impacts you every day.
No, absolutely. Look, I think in more ways than one. First of all, I'm really delighted to be in a situation where I'm in the consumer industry, but in a non-conflicting position. Because, the first thing is, although we all want to be outside in, this is a place where I keep a pulse of the consumer industry, in a very sort of organic way. And I think that's very helpful in my day-to-day job to see how the same challenges the world is talking about, whether it's a situation of tariffs or it's a situation of consumer sentiment in certain geographies, you start to get a pulse of how other organizations are really dealing with it. So I think that's been immediately interesting. And I would say even building out your skills and competencies. You're running an operational P&L is one thing, but if I've been fortunate to be on the audit committee, preparing for reporting and compliance is a whole different thing. So it does teach you some very new kind of skills as well, which one day would be useful as and when I grow in my own career and have more of an obligation towards that, right? So yeah, I would say more ways than one. And then, of course, not least the entire stretching how you think as a leader, because your peer group is suddenly at a different level and brings a very diverse set of perspectives than what you're typically used to. So all in all, very rewarding.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And Sarah, what advice would you have for board seekers or servers?
Yeah. I'll also go with the three, and building on Deeptha's. I think the first one is to be really clear on your why. Why do you want to be on a board? Your ability to articulate that and really think, Deeptha, I think you are really clear on your why in terms of how you're able to learn and grow, but also how it contributes to your day job. And that is so clear to understand, because it also shows that you understand what boards do. I think the second one is building on the notion of having the support of your leadership. That can also be a resource. I often advise people, particularly active executives, to talk with their CEO or whoever their leader is about the fact that they would like this as part of their development plan and enroll their leader in this as one of their KPIs. There's nothing better than having your CEO go, "You're right, Deeptha, this is a really important part of your development. I've got skin in the game and I'm going to use my network for you." So enrolling your leadership in that process. And then last but not least, I think it is really critical. People always ask me, how do I get on that list? And it's not a list, I promise you. The vast majority of boards still go through network. And so look around your network and look at your peers, look at your mentors who serve on boards today, and let them know this is an interest of you and why. Because the same group of people is getting calls. And so, Deeptha as an active executive can only serve on one board. I know, as people come to you that you value, you go, oh, I can refer these other people as you're getting calls. And so getting into that referral network, that is the number one way I know people get onto boards, because they get referred by peers who are already sitting on boards and no longer have capacity to take on another board.
Thank you. So Rebecca, I'd like to invite you back into the conversation to help us moderate the Q&A from our audience.
Yes, thank you. So I'm joining back. It was so interesting. And I think there are a couple of questions here that would be interesting to hear your perspective. And we haven't talked about it here. So what risk should we anticipate when joining a board? How can we mitigate them? So this is the question about the risk that you take when you take this formal role. So maybe Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, happy to give it a shot, right? I think it's different at different stages. Now, one very basic hygiene risk is the one around capacity. And I say that because I have had some very young, talented, high potential people in my team come and say, I would love to do this. I think I can do this. And I always caution people to think about it at the right stage in their career, because it is a call on your capacity, and it is something where you don't want to compromise your executive effectiveness in order to do this role. So that's a sort of personal and professional risk to be mindful of. I would say, listen, it is important to know what is the risk environment of the company that you're joining. And depending on the industry they're in, depending on the location they're in, depending on their financial history, that could take many different forms, right? There are those that have more legal oversight. There are those that are more in the eye of the public. There are those where the balance sheet isn't as healthy as one would like. And some of it is a challenge that could be attractive to some people to come in and help fix it, but you need to go in eyes open. And then last, I would say, is really culture and chemistry, because life is short. And even if it's, 5 or 6 days that you need to spend in a certain environment, it's good not to underestimate that when you're bringing in your heart and soul and mind and the best of yourself to those days in that situation, that you're also getting fun out of it and value out of it.
Sarah, do you want to expand on the risk questions? Anything to add?
Sure. Two thoughts that came up there, both in terms of capacity. You know, it's already a big commitment to be on a board. You know, it can be 16, 20 days a year. So it's a really meaningful portion of your time. And in the environment that we're in right now, there is going to be a crisis. And so that will expand. If you were on, you know, Unilever's or Kroger's board recently, you can only imagine the amount of time that those critical decisions were taking place. So don't underestimate that at all. So that would be my big watch out there from a risk perspective.
Thank you. Rebecca, what else is on the minds of our audience?
Yes. So another question, like we have two questions that are quite similar. One that is saying, for those of us who are just getting started in this process, what advice would you give to get started? Where would we start at getting prepared to even find the first board role? And another question that is quite similar is, what additional experiences can prepare you for a board role beyond your day job operating experience?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah,
Or do you want to go,
Sarah.
Deeptha?
You gave us a lot, so go for it. Yes.
So, you know, where to get started? I first, you know, starting to have conversations with, if you are an active executive, with your leader is a critical place, and with your network. But one of the things I find really helpful is to go through the process of writing your board bio. What that is very different from a resume, but it helps you articulate what is it that I could uniquely bring to a board before I even start to go out to conversation. And I think actually after this seminar, we'll make available to you sort of guidebook that we've created that is the path to the boardroom, that talks about where you might go to have some of those initial conversations, as well as how do you specifically write your board bio. So we'll make that available to this entire group. The networking is so critical. There are great organizations. I'm more familiar with the ones in the US, whether it's the National Association of Corporate Directors or the Latin American Corporate Director. They're very active groups that come together that are really helpful to each other. The Private Board Network, which posts jobs to that end. So looking at places where people are coming together to answer these questions.
Thank you. And one programming note, when we distribute the link recording, we are going to attach 2 white papers from Egon Zehnder that have a lot more helpful tips and tools, as Sarah was alluding to. So Deeptha, your builds?
Sarah captured it. I would add, I found it really interesting to actually educate myself on the composition of boards of the companies I'm interested in, because it's something you don't think too much about, and then you look it up and suddenly you have a bit of an aha moment when you see, in fact, that what you assumed everyone has to be a CEO or everyone has to be X, Y, and Z is actually not true. And if you want to do a little more research, actually many annual reports of organizations do describe their board composition, and very often will also describe the board competencies. And then when you look at it, you can see how, okay, here are those 8 members, and here are the different competencies they each bring. It also helps you to tune into where you might have a fit, or what is the kind of archetype that you might yourself be bringing that could be valuable to organizations like that.
Great. So the last question is also probably related to this networking question that we say it's so important. So what advice do you have for targeted networking to expand our existing network and open the door for board opportunities? I think it's also linked to what Sarah said before about people saying that the phone is not ringing. I'm not in any process, so maybe they need to have a better network. So Sarah, maybe you start with the answer.
I'm happy to, and it's a little bit repeating. I think this notion of talking to everybody that you know that is sitting on boards, one, to let them know, not to say, hey, how do I get on a board? But you're getting calls. Please think of me. This is why I would I want to be on a board, and this is what I think I uniquely bring. And giving them a couple of those keywords. So for example, if they're based in Europe, you go, and remember, I spent 10 years working in the US. So if you're looking for a leader who's got depth of experience in US, will you think of me for that? I think it helps if you give people a couple of hooks to think about you for, as opposed to just think about me for boards. Remind them what your specific board expertise is that you could bring.
Thank you. So were there any more questions, Rebecca, or was that a wrap on questions?
No, that was it. And thank you so much. It was very insightful.
So thank you, Deeptha and Sarah. And I believe we have a few more slides to share on our programming for the Women's Leadership Forum.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.
So International Women's Day. So, and I think Rebecca's going to pull up a slide. So many of you may have seen our International Women's Day campaign on the P&G Alumni social channels. And this is led by the foundation, one of our partners. And right now, we are looking to not only support International Women's Day by celebrating women advancing gender equality, but also through the generosity of our alumni network in donations. And the P&G Fund will generously match all donations up to $50,000. And you could see the links on where to donate on the different social channels, the P&G Alumni Foundation, the Alumni Network, the Women's Leadership Forum, many of our campaign posts throughout the month. So we thank you for your support there as well.
Okay, so I think we are coming to the end of this wonderful hour. And I want to invite you for our next webinar on Wednesday, April 9th. We will have Anne Frank that will moderate the session called Securing Your NED Role, a guide for aspiring female leaders. And we will have Francesca Esseri, Olivier Cumming, and Razan Donnelly talking to us about the non-executive board role. And I urge you to subscribe. I will put the link in the chat so that you can register already. So that's it. A couple of thank you to all the people who helped us to put together this webinar. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Deeptha. Thank you, Debra, for moderating. It was really inspiring and insightful. I learned a lot. Even though I'm on a board, I'm still learning, and I aspire to be maybe on more boards, but I took your comment on capacity. Be careful. It's a lot of work. So thank you, and handing on to you, Debra. Thank you very much.
And I just want to echo the thank you to Rebecca and Elsie and Luann and others that supported us in the development, and Deeptha and Sarah for the generosity of your time. You're both very busy executives, and this network is so special because our executives give back and impart their insights and experiences, which make our community stronger and wiser. So thank you for the generosity of your time.
Thank you, Debra.
Thank
Pleasure
you,
to be
and
here.
thanks for leading us, Debra.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.